The following days were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. I busied myself with chores I had long ignored. Scrubbing spotless counters, organizing drawers that needed no sorting. Anything to occupy the thoughts swirling in my head. Yet no matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake Evan's words from that night. You can actually breathe. He had seen through me, through the facade I had so carefully maintained for years. Daniel called once. A brief, obligatory check-in. His voice was distant, as though he was already thinking of the next meeting, the next city, the next deal. He asked if everything was fine at home. I told him yes. He didn't ask to speak with Evan. Later that evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, Evan walked in from his room upstairs, a hesitant look in his eyes. He hovered by the doorway as though uncertain whether to come in. Need help? He asked, nodding toward the basket that I shook my head. I've got it. Still, he stepped forward and sat beside me, pulling out a towel and folding it neatly. We worked in silence for a while, but the quiet wasn't comfortable anymore. It was charged. After a moment, he broke it. Did I say something wrong the other night? I paused, the shirt in my hands forgotten. No. Then why won't you look at me? My heart thudded. I turned to him, meeting his gaze. Because you're making this harder than it needs to be. He frowned, confused. What do you mean? I hesitated, words caught between truth and denial. You're Daniel's son. I'm his wife. This, whatever you think is happening, can't happen. He stared at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. I never said anything was happening. But maybe it's because something already has. In your heart, if not anywhere else. I stood abruptly, the tension unbearable. This conversation is over. As I turned to leave, he reached out. Not touching me, just resting his hand lightly on the table. I'm not trying to cause problems, he said quietly. But I see you, really see you. And I don't think he ever did. His words lingered in the air long after I left the room. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the truth I didn't want to face. I wasn't in love with Evan. But I wasn't in love with Daniel anymore either. And that realization, unspoken, irreversible, felt like the real betrayal. Morning light crept in through the blinds, but there was no peace in its arrival. Only a question hanging in the silence. How long could I keep pretending? And what would happen when I couldn't anymore? The storm came the night Daniel returned. The sky opened with rain as his car pulled into the driveway, headlights cutting through the downpour like a warning. I watched from the window, heart heavy, unsure whether I felt dread or guilt, or something far more complicated. He stepped inside, soaked and irritable. A brief nod in my direction, then a frown. Evan home? He asked, dropping his suitcase by the door. In his room, I replied, voice low. No kiss. No embrace. Just routine. For years this had been normal. But now it felt suffocating. Dinner was silent. Daniel scrolled through emails, answering calls between bites. Evan barely touched his food, stealing glances at me that I couldn't return. The weight of unspoken truths hung over the table like fog. After dinner, Daniel retreated to his office. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the sink, water running but my thoughts elsewhere. I hadn't said a word to Evan since that night. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't trust myself. Suddenly he was beside me, close enough to feel the heat of his presence. You're unhappy, he whispered, voice low, intimate. I didn't deny it. You deserve more than this. More than being forgotten. I turned, eyes meeting his. There was pain in them but also clarity. Evan, we can't do this. Why? Because it's wrong? Or because you're afraid to admit what you feel? His words shattered the fragile wall I'd built. I stepped back, tears stinging my eyes. Because I care about you. And that's exactly why I won't cross that line. For a moment, silence. Then he nodded slowly, eyes filled with something like respect. I understand. That night I sat alone, questioning everything. Not about Evan, but about the life I had built on convenience, not connection. Daniel had become a stranger. Evan had reminded me of who I used to be. Someone who wanted to feel alive, to be seen. The next morning I made a decision not born from guilt or desire, but from truth. I told Daniel we needed to talk. He looked up, distracted. Can it wait? I'm already late. No, I said firmly. It can't. For the first time in years I chose myself. Not for Evan, not for Daniel, but for the woman who deserved more than silence. And in doing so, I finally found my voice. I never imagined that one hotel room would change everything. Tea started as a simple family trip, a weekend getaway planned months in advance. My husband, Mark, had suggested it, hoping to reconnect, as he called it. But at the last minute, he canceled, citing an emergency at work, as he so often did. That left me and his son Alex alone to carry out the plans. Canceling felt like admitting defeat, so I agreed to go anyway, not realizing how that decision would haunt me. Alex was 22, polite, reserved, and always kept a respectful distance. We weren't close, but we weren't strangers either. I'd married Mark when Alex was already in college, and while our interactions were mostly cordial, I sensed a wall between us, one I'd never tried too hard to climb. Maybe I assumed time would do the work for me. The hotel lobby was packed, and the front desk manager wore the tired smile of someone barely holding it together. "I'm sorry," she said, tapping frantically at the keyboard, "but there's only one room left, and it has one bed." Her eyes darted between us, gauging our reaction. Alex shrugged. "It's fine, I'll take the floor." I forced a smile, uncomfortable but unwilling to make a scene. "Let's just get through it," I muttered, collecting the key card. The room was small, the bed even smaller. I busied myself unpacking, avoiding the awkwardness settling between us like fog. As the door clicked shut behind us, reality set in. We were two people alone, confined in a space too intimate for comfort. Later that night, as we both lay on opposite sides of the bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind restless. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional hum of the air conditioner. I couldn't sleep, not with the weight of Mark's absence pressing against my chest. "I'm sorry your dad bailed," I said softly, not expecting a response. Alex turned slightly toward me, his voice low. "I'm not surprised. He always puts work first." I heard the hurt in his tone, the kind of hurt you stop voicing after years of being unheard. We weren't so different, I realized. Both of us orbiting around a man who seemed present in title only. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," I whispered, unsure if I meant the trip or the marriage. Alex didn't respond, but the silence between us changed, no longer empty but full of something unspoken. Shared disappointment, lingering resentment, and something else I couldn't name. I turned away, closing my eyes, trying to block out the unease curling in my stomach. It was just one night, I told myself. One awkward night we'd forget by morning. But deep down I already knew. I wouldn't forget any of it. Morning light seeped through the thin hotel curtains, casting soft shadows on the floor. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, the quiet in that room grew louder, echoing the thoughts I couldn't silence. Alex was already up, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, gazing out at the parking lot as if it held answers to questions neither of us dared ask. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, my voice still hoarse from fatigue. He nodded without turning. "Yeah. You. Barely." He finally looked at me, and for a second, I saw the weariness in his eyes mirrored in my own. There was no accusation, no discomfort, just something unspoken that passed between us. An understanding that the night before hadn't been ordinary. The day stretched on with uneasy normalcy. We visited a nearby museum, took a walk by the river, even shared a laugh over a food truck's disastrous attempt at tacos. Felt normal. But beneath it all, there was a current, subtle but strong, pulling us toward a place we didn't fully understand. That evening we returned to the hotel room, both quieter than before. I reached for the TV remote, desperate to fill the silence. The screen flickered to life, but I couldn't focus. Neither could he. "I don't get it," I blurted, setting the remote down. Why did he push this trip so hard, just to bail at the last minute? Alex didn't answer immediately. Then with a sigh he said, "Because that's who he is. Promises big, delivers small." His words hit harder than I expected. I felt it too, the disappointment of always coming second. To his job. To his priorities. To everything. "I thought marriage would be different," I said, softer now. "I thought being chosen meant being valued." Alex glanced at me, eyes dark with something I couldn't read. People show love in strange ways. Or, sometimes they just don't. A pause lingered between us. Neither of us moved. "I'm sorry," he added, looking away. "You shouldn't have to feel that." His words, simple and genuine, sliced through the loneliness I'd been trying to ignore for years. He wasn't just Mark's son anymore. In that moment, he was someone who understood me more than my husband ever had. As we sat in silence, close enough to feel the tension but far enough to pretend it wasn't there. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the quiet realization that I was standing at the edge of a line I never thought I'd approach. I stood up, pacing to the window where the night had fully settled in. I needed air, space, clarity. Behind me, Alex's voice broke the silence. "We should talk. But not tonight." I nodded, grateful for his restraint, because deep down I wasn't sure I trusted my own.